Yeah, first of all, you're all very, very welcome. Thanks for coming along and watching this event. Thank you very much as well to Senator Ivana Bacik for taking time out of her schedule to speak to us. We all really, really appreciate it. And before we get into the interview, I'd just like to say a few brief words about the Law Society and about the event itself today. So the Law Society was founded in 1933, and for 87 years, the Society has strived to provide its members with opportunities to socialise, to engage in discourse, and to experience new phenomena. A crucial part of this endeavour is recognition of the sociological setting within which the Society finds itself, as demonstrated by the Barriers to Law campaign organised by Senator Lynn Rann, as well as the Diversity in Law campaign and the tireless work of access programmes across the country. It is undeniably clear that access to the Irish legal profession, and more specifically legal education, is amongst the most obstructed in the world. This goes against key cataclysms of a functional legal system, particularly one such as the Irish model, which is so proudly based in justice, fairness, and equality before the law. It is clear that the current system, discriminatory on the basis of race and socioeconomic status, not only warrants change, but necessitates it. It is for this reason that Access to Law was founded in 2020. It is a new programme which aims to highlight the inaccessibility and barriers of entry to third-level education for students from certain socioeconomic and racial backgrounds, not only in the law, but across all disciplines. It pairs student and professional mentors with secondary school students from the Republic and Northern Ireland, hosts a wide array of speakers, circulates information about different university access routes, and aims to show all participants that university education is both feasible and desirable. As it stands, one of our inaugural guests, Senator Ivana Bacik, is uniquely placed to offer some insight into the accessibility of university education. As a lecturer, Senator Bacik experienced legal education firsthand, while as a senator understands the legislative process on a statutory and practical level. Senator Bacik is an inspirational figure who has always championed sociological causes, as well as the vibrancy of student societies. It is for this reason that she is being, unfortunately, virtually awarded the honorary vice presidency of the Society as part of her input today. And so without further ado, it is with great pleasure and with thanks to the sponsors of Access to Law, A&L Goodbody, that I confirm Senator Bacik's vice presidency and thank her wholeheartedly for taking the time out of her schedule today to speak to this society. So, Ivana, I'm not sure if you wanted to offer any words or anything like that before we get into the interview. But...
Well, just to say thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you so much to the Law Society generally. It's a real honour and a pleasure to have been awarded this lovely honour, even if it has to be virtually, unfortunately. But I'm very grateful to you, and it's been a pleasure for not quite 87 years, but certainly for quite a number of years. I have worked closely with LawSoc, with FLAC, with the Students' Union in the law school, and other student activities and societies, just to try and ensure that we do all get a sense of that broader context within which law and legal education is carried on, and also, of course, to try and broaden out access to law, which has been something I've campaigned on for many years. And certainly the Trinity Access Programme has been a hugely important part of that, the Pathways to Law programme that they run. And indeed, it was when I was first appointed as a lecturer back in the 90s that myself and Professor Jerry White and somebody who was then a law student, but now a very esteemed colleague in DCU, Dr. Paul Downs, Paul, Jerry and I really pioneered the introduction of set-aside places in law for people from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. We did that on our own first through the law school. We set up a scholarship scheme and so on. And then we worked with TAP then, and gradually that was brought in as a college-wide access program. So it's a really great, it's had a really great history, and it's a really important, I suppose, means to try and broaden out access to what, as you say, has been traditionally a very inaccessible career path for many.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So just to get straight into it, I guess,
Sure.
I suppose my first question is, given your experience as a lecturer and a senator, what are the most significant barriers of entry to university education from a structural education standpoint and also from a statutory standpoint, I suppose?
Well, in terms of statute, I suppose there's no legislative barrier anymore, but unfortunately, cultural barriers still remain, cultural and socioeconomic. And this is what we see, not just for Trinity, but for university education generally, that there's often a barrier, an invisible barrier, we might say, where for many people, it is seen as an unattainable objective to go to university, where there's no role models in a particular community or in a particular school, for example, and where there's therefore no expectation among individual students or indeed their parents or wider families that they would go on to third level. So it's generally not a merit barrier, because many people don't go to university who have plenty of talent and plenty of ability and merit to get there, but who just lack the cultural, I suppose, the cultural impetus to get to generate that expectation, and therefore that that opportunity. So what programs like Trinity Access Programme do, and Pathways to Law and so on, is to try and break down some of those invisible barriers, to try and work with schools, because of course, you know, this has to start at a much earlier level than at third level or at CAO point. You have to work with secondary schools, as TAP do, Trinity Access Programme do, to try and ensure that expectations are heightened and awareness is heightened about the value and of university education, and about how anyone can get in if they, you know, so many people who may feel themselves excluded can in fact get into university. So you see programs like this across Ireland in different colleges, but TAP is a really positive and has been a really successful program that's been emulated in other universities, and it's trying to break down these invisible or cultural barriers.
And do you think that there's, the work of TAP aside, do you think that there's anything in particular that could be done in schools on top of what's already been done to break down the invisible barriers, as you call them?
Well, you know, there's a lot of really inspirational schools involved with TAP, and obviously, you know, increased resources would enable more schools to become involved. So that's the first thing, is of necessity at the moment. As with other university access programs, there's a limited number of schools involved, but there are, and you know, there are certain criteria. Obviously, socioeconomic disadvantage is the big, that was our big criterion actually when we set up the law school scholarship scheme in the 90s, and it remains a big issue, a big factor, because clearly that class and socioeconomic disadvantage are two of the biggest barriers. But there's also other groups in society who may feel excluded from education, for example, different age groups, because mature students traditionally are much, you know, we've only quite recently broadened out access to more mature students. Used to be very much minority numbers, and, you know, numbers are increasing. People with disabilities have often felt excluded, people from the traveller community, from different ethnic minorities. So these are all groups that with which TAP and other programs also are working, you know. But what more needs to be done in schools? I think, again, you know, we need to look at how we can roll out more access programming across primary schools, across more secondary schools, but also into primary schools, and indeed at earlier level. I mean, there's been a number of pilot programs to try and target socioeconomic disadvantage, and try and at preschool age, to try and ensure that kids are not already fallen behind, but you know, at the age of 5 when they start primary school, because you know, part of the ECI scheme, the success of that has been to ensure that the children will get some sort of preschool education before they even start primary. So that's the kind of thing I think that really needs more work.
Of course. And I guess to move away from the education for a moment and into the professional realm of it, I guess. Obviously, you've a lot of experience at the bar. You were crowned the Irish Woman Lawyer of the Year in 2019, and you've operated as a junior counsel as well. Do you find that the bar is a welcoming place, or, and I suppose if it isn't a welcoming place, what needs to be done in the bar to rectify that?
Well, I think it has got better, and I'm no longer in practice. You know, I left practice around 2011, but it was in practice for 15 or 16 years. And when I first came to the bar in Dublin, I should say, I had qualified as a barrister in London, and I found the bar in London much not easier, it's hard, but there was greater pathways of access to train as a barrister in London, because pupilages were paid critically. So people were being paid when they were training. Whereas when I came back to Ireland, deviling was and remains an unpaid internship, effectively, that everyone does for at least 1 year, often for 2 years of deviling, before they can build up their own practice to the extent where they might begin to make a living, albeit for most people it takes a lot longer than 2 years. So the bar in particular is a difficult profession to enter. Certainly many of us, and me included, worked at other jobs or continue to work at other jobs while having a practice as a barrister. It's a much more independent mode of working than say in London, where you have chambers, and so people are given more supports in entering, and that's really a big difficulty. So the way in which the bar is organised. Having said that, it is more flexible. Obviously, you can do other jobs alongside, and that can work for some people. But it's certainly, but the biggest barrier, I suppose, is that barrier of cost, of lack of support structures when you're in there. It's collegiate. The law library is a very collegiate place. It's welcoming to that extent, but people need to have resources to be able to I suppose, do the unpaid time that is required. So, the Bar Council has recognised this and has put in place various programmes, including mentoring programmes that are very welcome. Some years ago, I and a couple of Trinity colleagues, Eileen Drew and Catherine Costello, did a major study on discrimination against women in the legal professions called Gender Injustice, published in 2003. And we found there were, again, invisible barriers that many women were facing compared to men, both in the bar and in solicitors' professions. And since then, actually, there's been a good bit has been done by both the Law Society for Solicitors and the Bar Council to try and address these kind of structural but invisible cultural barriers, like a sort of old boys network that we found from our survey of practicing lawyers did exist. So I think things are improving, but there are still barriers around, particularly around class or I suppose financial resources and around gender that remain difficult to overcome, particularly at the bar, particularly given the way the bar is organised.
Okay. You mentioned there the kind of the old boys club kind of dynamic to it. I suppose, well, I guess, would a lot of that be rooted in politics as well, in terms of political beliefs and stuff like that, or would it just be a case of socioeconomic background, I guess?
Well, I should say that those words are not my words. They were the words of many of the respondents to our survey. We did a major survey. This was a Department of Justice funded study, I should have said, and we did a major survey of legal practitioners, both women and men. And Old Boys Club or Old Boys Network was a phrase that kept coming back to us through the survey responses. So it wasn't surprising to us, because certainly, up until relatively recently, there were relatively small numbers of women, particularly at the bar. More women would have gone into the solicitor's profession. Again, that is changing, and we're seeing that really changing significantly. Judges, 1/3 of judges are now women. But when we did the study in 2003, less than 10% of senior counsel were women. So, that shows you how low the numbers were that were of women coming up through the ranks. So that's some of that has been changing quite rapidly. Is it political? Well, in politics, you similarly have an old boys club. And again, I did research in 2009 with the Justice Committee, looking at what we call the 5 C's, which impede women's career progression in politics: lack of cash, lack of confidence, lack of access to childcare, a culture that is, again, built on this sort of network of old boys. And finally, those 4 C's, you could say, apply also in law, in fact, or in most professions, and there's lots of research on that. We found a 5th C to exist as a structural barrier for women in politics, which was candidate selection procedures in political parties. So we recommended that a gender quota be put in place, and I'm happy to say that was adopted, and in 2012 came in to law, and political parties must select at least 1/3, 30% of their candidates of each gender, or else they lose half their state funding. So they don't have to comply, but they lose a significant amount of funding if they don't. So, that has made a difference in the terms of the numbers of women coming forward and certainly being elected as TDs. But again, more needs to be done in terms of mentoring, creating more visible role models for women and so on. As I say, it's beginning to happen, and in law we're seeing, as we see more women judges and more women very senior levels, to have had a woman Chief Justice, to have a woman who's as DPP, to have a woman as Chief State Solicitor. These are all major milestones that have really helped, I think, to bring more women forward.
Of course. And I guess one last question on the whole political thing, because obviously we could talk politics for a very long time, I suppose. But I
Of
guess
course.
with your experience in the political realm, do you find that access to education is viewed as a priority by a lot of politicians, or do you think that it's kind of down the list in terms of what matters, I guess?
I think to be fair, I think most politicians of all parties would recognise that it is a significant issue. I mean, there's a huge amount of pride, I suppose, in the fact that, decades ago now, free secondary education was rolled out. It feels extraordinary to anyone my age or younger that wasn't available before. But I do think we've still got a lack of prioritization for preschool, and I would say that remains a really glaring area where in Ireland we lag behind other European countries in terms of lack of access to high quality, affordable childcare and preschool education. So, Minister Catherine Zappone was very strong on that and really did try to move it on. Certainly in the Labour Party, we developed a very kind of broad policy on bringing forward universal free childcare, and I think that's really the next step in terms of access to education, because you can't start early enough. Any educator will tell you that you can't start early enough in terms of trying to ensure equity of access. And often by the time university access programs are are operational, a lot of the disadvantage has already been built in for individuals. So we do need to look again at our preschool system.
Okay, my next question is kind of, I guess, I mean, it has a simple answer. I'm sure there's an obvious answer to it. But in your experience as a lecturer, do you feel as though there's a direct correlation between the standard of student and their socioeconomic background? And do you feel that during your time in Trinity that you've been given the opportunity to teach a wide variety of pupils, I guess?
Well, it's an interesting question. No, I don't. I have never encountered a correlation between socioeconomic background and student standard. And I hasten to say, of course, that marking is generally anonymous. Certainly, all exam marking is anonymous. So, you know, and in any case, even where it isn't anonymous, we don't know students' socioeconomic background. So it simply isn't a factor, you know, and I would always stress it's not a factor, and there's no correlation between standards and socioeconomic background. And indeed, you know, Trinity Access Programme have got really clear statistics actually proving that too, and showing how well students have done. For example, the Pathways to Law programme, you know, I've seen the data on that, and students on that programme have performed really strongly, getting 2-1s, firsts, and so on. So, so there's no correlation there. Have I been given the opportunity to teach as wide a variety of students as is possible? Well, you know, it's, as I say, the access programs have done a huge amount to increase diversity among the student population in law, as in other faculties. But you know, we're still not achieving, I think, the requisite diversity to reflect society more widely. So I think we need to do more on this, but it has improved nonetheless. Interestingly, you know, in law we do have a very particular, or we've always had a particular cohort of students from Northern Ireland, which actually has been really great, because you know, I think certainly traditionally law and medicine were two faculties in Trinity that attracted more students from Northern Ireland proportionately than any other faculty, and that did mean again a different mix in the student body, and that was very welcome too. So there's lots of different ways of achieving diversity. Socioeconomic class is one area we need to do more on. Gender, well, law students now there's more women studying law than men. That became the case sometime around the late 80s. I was in the first group of students, we were told, where there were equal numbers of women in the class, and that was, you know, graduating in 89. So, you know, we're seeing greater gender mix, certainly, more women coming through, but we need to see more in terms of socioeconomic class, regional diversity too. So, you know, we have to be careful that Trinity is seen as open and accessible to students from all over the island, you know.
You mentioned there Northern Irish students. I think one thing that comes up quite a bit from Northern Irish students in my year in particular, it's just an anecdotal thing, is that the grade conversion can be quite difficult. So from going from A levels to leaving cert points. And do you think that anything needs to be done there at like a statutory level in terms of altering that to make it more accessible for people from?
Again, well, it's not statutory, and from time to time the conversion scale has been adjusted, and each time it's obviously had knock-on effects. So some years ago it was changed in a way that certainly I've been told from students and prospective students in Northern Ireland made it less easy for them to access Trinity. So, you know, before that, I think there was a sense that it was the A level, the conversion was more. It was less fair to CAO than to A level, or less fair to leaving cert, I should say, than to A level. So there's been various different perceptions that have gone into different changes. I think it has to be kept under review all the time, but it's very difficult. I mean, I was involved in some of the Erasmus program conversion tables over the years, and it's very difficult to achieve a fair conversion of grades between different systems. So, you know, it's always an ongoing process, and it's never perfect. But I think it's important that students from the North don't feel disadvantaged. You know, that is really important.
And I guess just one last question. Just in one of the mentorship sessions that we had last week with the school, actually, it was quite sad, to be honest. I think it was Professor Neville Cox asked if anybody was actually thinking of studying law in Trinity, and a guy put up his hand and he said he'd love to, but he felt he was too stupid.
Oh no!
Which
Oh God!
it's kind of stuck with me a little bit. So I guess kind of links into this. If you had one piece of advice for a student from an area of low progression who has experienced discrimination of any kind or who wanted to pursue a university degree, what would that advice be?
Go for it. That's the advice. Go for it. If you want to do law, if you've even an inkling about doing law, you know, put yourself forward for it. Never feel you're not up to it, or or that it's not for you. For you know, if you want to do it, go for it. That's the answer, I think. And I think increasingly we're ensuring that law is more accessible, not just studying law at university, but going on to become a practicing lawyer. And the other thing I always say to students is there's loads of pathways into law. If you don't get into a law degree program, loads of our top judges didn't do law either as undergrads. They became to law through other sorts of degree and went to do professional qualification afterwards. There's loads of different routes and pathways in, and equally loads of people who study law at undergrad don't go on to be practicing lawyers. Half of my class didn't. So I think the thing is not to get dejected by feeling that something is closed off to you. There's always ways through, and just go for it if you want to do it.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. Thank you very much for taking the time. I think that's pretty much all that we have to get through. Thanks again for taking the time to speak to us. I really, really appreciate it. I'm sure you're very, very busy these days and probably zoomed out of it as well, I'd say.
Like all of us, Jonathan, but thank you very much. And I really appreciate the award from the Law Soc. And I hope you have a good year ahead in spite of all the COVID restrictions and in spite of Zoom fatigue and everything else.
Fingers crossed. We'll be out of it soon, I'm sure.
Hopefully.
Right. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.